Thank you so much. Even though the title of this one is called Market Drivers for Mineralization Project, we will slightly alter it to talk about barriers to scale. It is the same, it's just whether you're trying to solve it or think somebody else will solve it. Just to get us started, the Net Zero Industry Act calls for 50 million tons of injection capacity in EU per year by 2030. That's in 6 years from now, or actually 5 years and 3 months. And the sobering fact, as we've heard earlier today, and as all of you know, is that as of today, we don't have any megaton projects operating at scale. Although we have multiple pilots in different areas and smaller volumes have successfully been injected here for the last decade, it's clear that there's more to be done. So the Clean Air Task Force, not surprisingly, points out that we actually need all of the current projected and announced projects in Europe to be realized on schedule and on time, on budget. And they're pointing to a few policies that are supporting and that might be able to fast-track some of the investments. They include strong carbon pricing, incentives for investments, regulatory drivers, support for building out cross-border carbon transport infrastructure, and faster permitting for storage sites. And those are exactly some of the points that we will be discussing here, and hopefully get closer to a common view on what would it take to get this industry rolling. So first, Rachel, you as a researcher and an analyst, could you start by giving us kind of a global state of the nation on the industry? Where are we today as you see it?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for having me in Reykjavík. It's my first time visiting here. So we've had great overviews of carbon capture and CDRs in terms of the industry today, so it's made my job a little bit easier, but just to give some kind of high-level thoughts and some key numbers. So I don't think I'm telling anybody in this room anything new when I say that we need carbon capture and storage to reach net zero. As you just mentioned, we need a whole host of different technologies. Just to put some numbers around this, so in the IEA's net zero energy scenario, carbon capture and storage grows to 1 gigaton in capacity by 2030. That compares to around 55 million tons today. So significant growth is needed by 2030, and then from 2030 to 2050, we need to get to 6 gigatons per year of capture capacity, and that includes industrial capture, includes direct air capture and BECCS as well. So there's demand from a climate perspective, that's clear, and there's potential for significant growth. In terms of the supply that we potentially need, or the supply we have to meet that demand, that 55 million tons that we have right now, that's up from around 45 million tons at the end of 22. So it is growing. In terms of future growth, depending on the estimates that you look at, in the pipeline we have around 400 to 500 million tons of projects in terms of capture capacity in the pipeline to start up by 2030. So 8 or 9 times growth by 2030 based on what we can see, but that's still only 40 or 50% of what the IEA says we need to get to net zero. So that's the sort of supply and demand picture. In terms of market drivers and hurdles, which is the focus of this panel, I think the market drivers can be boiled down to 2 broad buckets. The first is basically corporate strategies and corporate targets, companies wanting to ensure that they maintain or gain social license to operate. And then the other bucket would be policy. And we've heard a lot about that today, but that could include everything from government support, funding, initiatives, or even putting a price on carbon. When I talk to investors, which is the main part of my role, when I talk about carbon capture, the first question I always get is, does the economics work? Will the economics work? And I think that's a key question and one that the industry has struggled with for a while. And I think that's really where those policy drivers come in. And these policy drivers can look very, very different. So I'm sure we'll talk about these in detail later on in the conversation, but in Europe, the key driver of decarbonisation is the emissions trading scheme. Right now, or recently, that's been trading, allowances have been trading between 65 and 70 euros per tonne. And I think we all realize that that's not high enough to incentivize carbon capture and storage in Europe. We have CBAM coming in, and with that, the gradual phase out of industrial free allowances. And that will force industrial players to look at their emissions and pay for them for the first time. So that's a really interesting driver, because industrial players will need to decide whether they want to buy allowances in the market or if they want to abate their emissions through investments in technologies like carbon capture or some other technologies as well. The other interesting kind of dynamic of CBAM and the phase out of these allowances is it should tighten the market, because the allowances are being removed. So that should bump that EUA price up. At Morgan Stanley, we think it goes to above 120 by the end of the decade, which at those levels, that's when carbon capture and storage starts to look more interesting. In the US, the model is very different. The IEA has been a key driver of carbon capture projects starting up or being planned. And we heard about that earlier from Marina, with the tax credit being increased. So now more projects are economic. So the economics can work with policy support. There are other key hurdles that I think are important. For example, infrastructure, logistics, public perception. These are all topics that have been talked about this morning. But I think economics is really important, because if you're a corporate thinking about doing carbon capture, it's really, you have to make the economics work before you can even think about those things that come further down the line. So it's usually the first box that needs to be ticked.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that was a good run through of the industry and exactly where we are. And you mentioned policy as one of the areas that, of course, can get us highlighted. And if we just look at here in Europe, there's been like 3 major policy measures introduced. The Net Zero Industry Act that I mentioned, the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy, and the 2040 climate targets. So Chris, if we just start with you, given that you also spent quite some time working with this, do you believe that these provide the necessary momentum or can actually help accelerate some of these CCS projects, and in particular geological storage, given that we're here in Iceland?
Before I tackle the answer to that question, I just wanted to note that I'm not the first Chris on the stage this evening. And I looked at the participants list, and very briefly, there's a Christos, a Christoph, Krista, 4 Christians, and no less than 5 Chris's. So I don't know what number of Chris that makes me, but it's a high one. Yeah, I think the EU policy developments are super interesting, and of course they are world leading. The US is leading in terms of stimulating supply of carbon removals, and Europe is leading on the regulatory side, which leaves, I think, another big aspect untouched by either jurisdiction, and indeed by any jurisdiction, which is really creating the demand for carbon removals. Today we're dealing with a voluntary market, and we need to be moving towards a compliance market. And the European Union has made some steps towards that, towards both. Initially, mainly the voluntary market through the carbon removal certification framework. The kind of mid-term horizon will be set through these 2040 targets, which is super, super important. And then, of course, the longer-term horizon will be set once we understand how carbon removals can relate to the ETS and other things. So I think, yes, the European Union has done some really good things which are very important, but they're not really sufficient. I think what we would need, in the short term, is a much clearer political signal. So the European Union has a number of different policies which we've heard about today already, and what I have never heard is the European Environment Commissioner stand up and make a speech which ties all of those together and explains how EU policy is structured and what the architecture is and where it's all pointing. I think that would be a super, super useful market signal without needing to make any new policy. The 2040 targets are going to be critical. we would love to see some separate carbon removal targets, which are then further separated into kind of forestry or land-based targets on the one hand and permanent removal targets on the other, both as a target for the industry to aim at and a signal to the market for where it needs to go, but also as a key tool to avoid mitigation deterrents. And then in the longer term, yeah, what do we do about these compliance markets? But I think more importantly than what the EU is doing is really how does that fit into the global system? In our EU advocacy work, we've spoken to small governments of small EU countries who are not in favor of separate targets for carbon removals. Why? Because they think that that's something that they're going to be forced to buy from France and Germany. France and Germany are going to buy this industry, just like the US is buying this industry, and then it's going to be foisted on the rest of the world who's going to be forced to purchase those carbon removals. And I think unless we address that, unless we get every country in the world to really understand its own potential to produce and export carbon removals, we're going to end up in a huge mess in COP, and this sort of geopolitical aspect really needs to be fixed very soon.
We will come back to that, but to your own point, let's also kind of just lift ourselves a little out of the EU and look a bit broader on the world. And Rachel mentioned CBAM earlier, and you also touched upon this voluntary versus compliance market. And Despoina, I know that you have some points on this, especially on kind of how the CBAM might be driving the compliance market actually and help unlocking the demand side of the industry.
Yeah, definitely. Also to start with names, I think I'm the first and maybe the last Despoina on this stage, so yeah. So I'll start with a little fact. So the CCSA did a delivery plan last year, and we surveyed some of the project pipeline in the UK, and about 1/3 of the project pipeline said they are at risk of relocating overseas because of the sort of regulatory and funding environment, and that it's attractive elsewhere. But what really comes into play here is the risk of carbon leakage and how a CBAM is able to mitigate that. Because a project will not be able to put all that money and all that investment into a CCS project or a carbon removal project if they have to be thinking about how they can compete fairly in domestic and export markets. So it's really, really crucial that that is in place. And I know both the EU and the UK are looking into it. In terms of how it all works together, obviously CBAM is one part of the puzzle, and the other one is the ETS free allowances. So the approach needs to be holistic, not only in the UK, but also when we look at both the ETS systems and both the CBAMs across the water. They need to work together. They need to be as equivalent as possible, because a lot of these projects will be looking to transport CO2 across the water or cross-border. A big example in the North Sea is how close we are with Norway and the Northern Lights project. So all of that needs to work together, basically. And as Rachel mentioned, it is a big push towards having a higher carbon price, which will then unlock that extra revenue for these projects to be able to reach final investment decisions, which is a huge milestone.
Absolutely. I think we'll come back to prices and how we actually create that market pull, because as in any good new industry, we need the market first to actually be able to do all the investments. But Giana, let's just get you into the discussion as well. Are you seeing some of the similar trends? Are you starting to see inflection points from your perspective?
Yeah, I think in the US, we are lucky to have a history, about a decade's worth of investment in carbon removal technologies. The vast majority of that investment has been really focused on direct air capture and storage, mostly because direct air capture fits into very traditional frameworks, policy frameworks around traditional carbon capture and sequestration. So that's been a sort of natural extension of the US federal government's investment in carbon management technologies more broadly. I know Marina touched upon a lot of the policies that exist today, but we have quite a bit, about $150 million in research funding every year at the Department of Energy for carbon removal technologies. There's also a 45Q tax credit that gives about $180 per ton for direct air capture plus sequestration. And most recently, the Department of Energy launched a first-of-a-kind carbon removal purchasing prize, which is the first government procurement effort across the world. They have $35 million to purchase a full portfolio of carbon removal solutions. I think the US perspective is a little bit different because a lot of the policies that we're talking about are on the supply side. They're really focused on technology development, driving down costs, improving efficacy, building demonstrations, and all of those things are going to be really necessary in the near term to then incorporate these technologies into, the EU ETS or other compliance markets. And so hopefully that's sort of an advantage or a value add that the US government can bring to other global decarbonization goals. And there's a lot of international collaboration happening for the US to share some of its lessons around building these projects in the real world that is happening now, and I think should grow to make sure that we can all meet our climate goals. I think in working with the carbon removal companies, the number one thing that we hear as a challenge is a lack of demand signal for carbon removal, which policy I think has a really strong role to fill. I think carbon removal is unique in the sense that there aren't a lot of pre-existing customers for carbon removal. We're essentially generating a public good, and therefore it makes sense for the federal government to step in and help create some of those demand drivers, whether it's by providing more clarity and transparency in the voluntary carbon market, whether that means compliance markets or other types of demand signals that are more in the sort of carrot over stick frameworks. And it's probably going to take all of those types of policies to help get us to 10 gigatons of removal every year globally.
But maybe let's just stick on that, or stay to that, because I think this whole stick or carrot approach is actually a good discussion to have on. Today, it's primarily driven by a voluntary market. We're expecting the compliance market to come in and to actually help accelerate the industry. But do we believe most in the carrot or the stick? Is it a higher price on carbon, or is it actually incentives to help fuel the industry? If we just take a round starting anywhere. I'll point to one of you if you don't start talking. Giana, we'll start.
I'm happy to. I'm going to give.
We left it with you. So carrot or stick?
Yeah, I'm going to give a disappointing answer in that I think both are extremely important. I think long term, if we're thinking about scaling carbon removal, we have to have a stick. I think we've seen the voluntary carbon market be relatively volatile and also embedded in traditional carbon offsets that are trading at levels of $1 to $2 per ton, and it's essentially impossible for a lot of these carbon removal companies to compete with those prices. I think there's also a lot of challenges embedded in traditional carbon offset markets around accounting, transparency, project viability. And so I think while voluntary carbon offset markets can create an important demand signal in the near term, I think we see companies again and again have a difficult time getting concessionary capital, project finance, venture capital funding based on the voluntary carbon market because it's just seen as a risk, and that's not a risk that oftentimes investors are willing to take on. So I think it can be really helpful to companies in the near term when they can access it, when they can get some of these buyers that are willing to pay a higher price per ton. But eventually, we'll probably need to move towards compliance markets. And I think carrots also in the near term, beyond the voluntary carbon market, can help drive down costs and make it more economical for compliance markets in the future.
Anyone else with perspectives on how we get the compliance market up and running and how we also get more incentives for the voluntary market?
Yeah, I also think it's both. Very disappointing answer. But they almost fulfill different purposes. You can't really compare them because the reason why people go to these markets they start from different intentions. So for the voluntary side of things, it has to do with corporate targets, climate benefits, additional climate benefits that you want to showcase that your company is doing. On the compliance side of things, well, you have to do it, and it's the lowest cost of compliance. It's the most cost-efficient way of reaching your emissions reductions. So in that market, you will unlikely get the price that you would get in the voluntary market, but they fulfill different purposes. So it really depends on what you're going for.
Yeah, but I'm also hearing you say we need both sides of the coin. So we do need needed to be cheaper to actually do something about it than to continue doing what we've always done. But we probably also need some sort of incentives to help accelerate the market. There's also something about kind of the reliability and trustworthiness of the industry. And I think, Chris, you very slightly touched upon the carbon removal certification framework that is currently under development. How significant is that policy in actually making this a proper industry and a market that both off-takers and investors can trust and rely on?
Well, I think it remains to be seen, and Oliver played it down in his remarks earlier on.
You can play it up.
I understand why. No, I understand why, but I think that that it remains to be seen because it is formally just a voluntary market instrument. So it's there to lubricate a future European voluntary market in carbon removals, and it'll be a super useful tool. I think that what people hope and expect in the market is that the standards which are developed for this particular voluntary market tool, which is, let's say, a short-term tool for the next, let's say, 10, 15 years, that those standards and those methodologies and the learnings that we get from that system will then be applicable and applied to a future compliance market. So if it's successful, it could be extremely relevant to a future compliance market. If not, then much less so.
Makes sense. And I also think this is just one of the areas, but in general, when you're building a new industry, there's no standards for everything from the capture to the concentration to, you can mention anything along the new supply chain that we need to build. And for now, it seems like EU is doing some things. UK is tagging along a bit, is that fair to say? Or trying to be part of the family, maybe? And the US has their whole own way of looking at it. So in general, global standards, both in terms of carbon pricing in order for nations and companies to stay competitive, but also to have an equal playing field, but also standards in terms of making this a global industry and global supply chains. How important is that, and how do we, whose role is that? Anyone? Yeah, Chris?
I mean, I think there's a, when you say standards, there's a vast range of different things that could be covered by that. From very technical standards through to process standards, through to regulatory standards, through to moral and ethical standards, and all of them are pointing, all of them have the same objective at the end, which is to create a credible and trustworthy product or market. So yeah, I think, in the absence of a lot of these, a lot of the more, let's say, longer term and permanent standards, let's say the regulatory and legislative standards, I think the industry needs to step up and create some of its own, and that's what a large part of the voluntary market is doing right now with the emergence of Pure Earth and isometric and other kinds of standards like that. And you may be hearing a little bit more from the negative emissions platform about certain kinds of standards in the coming weeks as well.
We're looking very much forward to that. Now we have talked a lot about the voluntary markets, also because we're still awaiting for the compliance markets. But you mentioned that compliance markets would most likely go for the lowest possible price in order to be compliant. But what we've also seen, Giana, I think to your point, is in the voluntary markets, we've also seen quite a pricing game of not necessarily valuing neither quality of the projects nor permanence of storage for those that actually have storage as important. So with that in mind, do we think that, how do we raise kind of the ambition levels and the quality? Can we do that in the voluntary market as well? Or do we need the compliance market to actually elevate the standards to create a different price point, but then also to attract the investors?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this one. I think there's a lot we can do to raise the credibility of the voluntary carbon market. The reason why a lot of these companies are making voluntary carbon purchases is for brand, for marketing, for reputation, and a lot of these companies have actually come under fire for purchasing low quality, typically forestry or emissions avoidance and emissions reduction credits. And so a lot of these companies are turning to carbon removal as an opportunity to purchase something that is more credible, has longer duration of storage, and has a more meaningful climate impact. I think the challenge is that buying carbon removal today is extremely difficult. And if you're a person who's outside the carbon removal field, you're maybe a one-person sustainability team at a major corporation, it's really difficult to sift through what's a good carbon removal project and what's a bad carbon removal project. And if you've already had, an article in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Guardian saying X company purchased bad forestry offsets, you're really risk averse to doing that again. And so I think there are a couple things that we need to do. One, we need to drive down the cost of technologies to make this more economical for buyers. Two, I think we need to create more consistent standards and methodology so companies know what they're buying, they know what the quality is, and that there's greater transparency, about whether those projects deliver or don't deliver, and there's appropriate sort of insurance mechanisms to make sure that if projects don't deliver, that companies are still covered. And then I think lastly, there needs to be more guidance and enforcement around, what carbon removal can and should count for in corporate sustainability. Right now, we're waiting for guidance under SBTI, which is the Science Based Target Initiative, which will provide more guidance to companies who have net zero commitments under SBTI for carbon removal. And that will let companies know how much carbon removal they should be purchasing, what it should count towards. Should it count towards residual emissions, historic emissions, and that kind of clarity gives companies more confidence in buying carbon removal and knowing that it'll actually count towards those goals. I think in addition, there are roles that the government can take to help prevent fraud and bad purchases, specifically greenwashing, and there's a couple organizations in the US federal government like the CFTC, the SEC, the FTC, lots of acronym soup organizations who are in charge of some of these green claims.
And maybe just to add another acronym to that, in Europe we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is coming in, and that includes one of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards includes companies having to report on how they use carbon removals. So from an investor perspective, we will get more information, and also from a public perspective, we'll get more information on how companies are actually using their credits and what sort of credits they're buying, which I think helps build confidence in companies that are using removals, especially those that are really doing their due diligence.
Yeah. Anyone else has a comment?
Perhaps to add just, in the compliance side of things, things are, I think, a bit simpler sometimes. The ETS is very fit for purpose in the sense that it's there to abate fossil emissions. Hence, the removals that would be integrated into that should be high integrity, high quality, permanent removals. And we're here to talk about mineralization. That is the golden standard of permanence. So in that sense, you know where you're getting, and the compliance market will also in itself not only drive the demand, but sort of demonstrate that this is a technology that works. Here it is, it's permanent, end of story.
So I'm hearing you say actually that the rise of the compliance market will also elevate the standards for quality and for permanence because they're in it for compliance and to actually, they need to be able to prove.
Exactly, because it is for compliance and there's enforcement and penalties. You will not be allowed to trade in something that will not be permanent. So I think standards will be even stricter in that sense.
We can hope so. When we had a short talk before sitting on stage, we got to talk about there's, of course, many different areas of drivers, of barriers. We could have talked about financing as one, policy is another, pricing is a different one, cross-border transportation. But an area that you all kind of returned to was permitting. And I've worked a lot in renewables where permitting is also the big barrier. But just a quick round on permitting as it comes to especially geological storage, I would assume. What does it look like today, and how can we potentially make that better?
Maybe I can start on that one. So I mentioned the project pipeline earlier, and in general, out to 2030, that pipeline, we have seen the number of projects that are expected to start up on the capture side growing. Every time I look at this data every quarter, those numbers sort of tick up out to 2030. But in the very near term, we've seen a lot of projects actually pushed to the right. And one of the reasons for that is permitting. And like you said, this is nothing new for clean tech, right? We've seen it in renewables, we've seen it in all sorts of projects. In the US, I think, and you can talk to this probably much better than I can, but it can take quite a long time to get these Class 6 permits. A lot of them have to be done at the federal level because only a few states have state primacy. So there's a lot of time elapsed, which I think the industry didn't expect to have it take that much time to get these permits done. And as a result, we've seen the storage pushed to the right and the capture projects pushed to the right. And that it's not just a US issue, it's a global issue as well.
Yeah. Giana, did you have any comments on?
Yeah, I think that's a great characterization of where the U.S. is right now. There are about 150 pending Class 6 well applications in the United States. About, I think, 5 or 6 have been approved so far. So I think the EPA really needs to make sure that they have the capacity and the resources and the expertise to review those permits in a way that upholds the quality, ensure that these projects are safe, ensure that there's robust community engagement and consideration of environmental justice issues, but also that can help get these projects built in the real world, because of course we all think climate is a very urgent and pressing problem, and so we need to sort of start scaling these solutions more quickly. I would say mineralization faces a specific challenge because a lot of the Class 6 regulations were really written for traditional geologic storage, and there's not a lot of clarity around whether CO2 when it's mixed with water, if that can be injected underground, if there can be multiple, mineralization boreholes to inject the CO2, what the containing mechanism is. And so I think EPA in the near term could do, or provide a lot of value by creating more clarity around whether mineralization qualifies for Class 6, and if so, how the regulations apply to this very different technology.
Yeah. Chris, Despoina, any thoughts on this?
Thanks. Yeah, in the UK, there's been quite a few delays in terms of due to permitting, and for industry, delays in permitting means cost, means a lot of money. So I think the thing that we need to remember is that this is an emerging and nascent industry, and we need to put a lot of focus into that, a lot of funding into R&D, so that then when it comes to the actual regulatory and permitting planning aspects of things, you can move a bit faster, you can streamline things, and then in terms of what government can do, more resourcing to regulators is absolutely key.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know that some people say and not just some, I think many people say it's easier to get a permit to open a new oil and gas field today than it is to open a new CDR project. And that's because the industry is new and because the regulators haven't figured out their processes and criteria yet, and the whole thing is just very new. But the Net Zero Industry Act, which the European Union adopted in recent months, has provisions in it to make permitting easier for the technologies that are covered. Now, there are some CCS technology, or CCS technology is covered, which of course is relevant to a section of the carbon removal space, but it's not covering the whole carbon removal space. And we think that's a shame, and some of the justification that I was given for the EU not putting carbon removals in general into the benefits of the permitting provisions was that we didn't want to distract from the priority of emissions reductions over carbon removals. And now, as Oliver was explaining, I don't think that's what the science is pointing us at. It's not saying first you must stop emitting and then chronologically you must remove carbon dioxide. We need to start scaling carbon dioxide removal immediately, and that includes permitting for those projects. However, permitting is not always the key barrier, and there's a well-known enhanced or ocean alkalinity enhancement project in Cornwall in the UK, which had all its permits but was simply rejected by the local residents. Yeah. So the permits are not always enough.
Absolutely. We need both the funding and the permits and the willingness of politicians and people. And on that point, as we are creating a new industry, and as this can be difficult to understand for some, but frightening for others, how important is both quality, to return to that, but also this permanence of storage, given that we are talking mineralization here, to build this trust across people, across politicians, across off-takers, and across investors. So on that bar of 1 to 10, how important is kind of the quality and the permanence? And how do we convey this message? Are we good enough at actually explaining what we do here? Not here, but in the industry. Rachel.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first on that one. So I said earlier, you can't talk about kind of carbon capture in general without talking about economics. That's question 1 that I get from investors. Question 2 is, does carbon capture even work? And question 3 is storage safe, and will the CO2 eventually escape? So it's really kind of top of mind for, I don't think just investors, but general public. Is carbon capture safe, and is that CO2 going to escape? So yeah, I think it's really high up there on the list. In terms of convincing is the wrong word, but in terms of convincing people that it works or showing that it works, I think it's very difficult to do. I'm a chemist by background, and even I sometimes struggle with all of the acronyms, and we talked earlier about the number of different terms for carbon storage. And also the new technology that is coming out today, understanding which are the best technologies, which technology suits specific industries, for example, the key challenges in storing CO2. So I think it's difficult. I think one of the key things is almost kind of proving by doing. Yeah. So as we see these carbon capture projects start up on the capture side and then also on the storage side, there's a de-risking sort of mechanism. The more projects that start up on time, on budget, that capture CO2 successfully and store it successfully, I think that will happen naturally, but that is obviously a much slower process than a lot of us would probably like. Anyone else view on this?
Yeah, I think obviously quality, you need to know what you're buying, right? Yeah. And obviously high quality is super important. I think that there's a need for different types of permanence, or different lengths of permanence, and everyone understands that if you plant a forest and you plant it well, that it will have other benefits for the environment than just sequestering carbon dioxide, biodiversity and all the rest. So I certainly don't feel like it's only permanent carbon removals. It's only direct air capture and Carbfix type solutions underground which are going to be dominating the market. No, I think there's a need for everything, and I think the way it should be driven is coming back to the point that I made earlier. Each country should decide what it can do on its territory, and what it needs to do, what's best for its own communities, and what's best for its own environment, and that will differ.
I'm pretty sure we all agree that we need all of the technologies and all of the different projects currently to scale to have a chance at doing this. And I also got a little tip during lunch that we should probably either broadcast Kari or just send him around in buses to the world and explaining how this works. We'll talk about that later. I want us to finish off on a lightning round. I know that there's no silver bullets. I think this is just a conversation. The rest of the day today is obvious. But if you could wish for one thing, if you could send an ask to anyone, the investors, the politicians, God even, what would it be? Despoina.
I'll go back to compliance. I think it's a big push at the moment, but what we hear from our members is that industry is there, industry is ready to deliver that investment. What they need is that clear vision, clear long-term certainty that this will happen and that demand will exist. Compliance is one way to do that, but obviously not a silver bullet.
Chris?
What I want today is a political signal from the European Commission about what place carbon removal has in EU climate policy, and that it encourages the market to invest in it.
Giana?
Large-scale government procurement of carbon removal, top of my list.
That's a good one. Rachel?
This was mentioned by Chris earlier, but I think there seems to be a misunderstanding about what kind of carbon capture is and what it does. I think quite a lot of people see it as cheating, potentially, but for certain industries and certain sectors, for example, cement, I should have said Chris Davis, by the way, I realized. there are all these Chris's. For certain industries, and cement is a great example, carbon capture is one of the only tools that we have to actually decarbonize, and we need to decarbonize industry if we want to build out other clean technology. So yeah, that would be my one thing.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.